Hey everybody, this is Alex here with Alex Velti Music, and today I'm going to walk you through my mix template. Really the whole goal of this mix template is to help you release more music. You need a process so that you can release more music. And ultimately, I believe that a template like this will help your songs spend way less time on the hard drive and way more time on Spotify playlists. So let's walk through this. Okay, just a couple things to note. This is a Logic template, so if you use Ableton or Pro Tools or something like that, Reaper, you're going to be able to apply these principles on those DAWs or within those DAWs, but you can't just copy this template over. So just let it be noted that this is a Logic Pro template. Let's walk through this. I've got a pretty basic setup here, and one of my philosophies behind this is I like my mixes to be production first. So I would say commit very early on in the production stage before you bring it into mix, and that will really help you just streamline your process and make way more decisions earlier so that you can just finalize and tweak in the mix and even in the master stage from there. Here's where I kind of start off. I've got these things grouped, and you'll see these groups are kind of noted by these colors. This is really easy on the eyes. It's easy for your brain to process and make decisions. I love color coding things, and especially when the tracks are imported, I will assign the tracks the same color because for one, it just looks awesome too. It's just like such a de-stressor on the brain as you're mixing your music and trying to really dial this in because it can get so intense and at times frustrating. So keep it organized. I've got each of these sections bussed, so all of my drums or like all of my bass, guitars, and you can look at the colors here, are going to be going into buses. So I've got like a drums bus, keys bus, vocals, and all of that, which ultimately will end up going into my master bus. Now the only thing to note here with the busing is that I've got my lead vocals going into a bus, and then I've got my background vocals going to a bus, but then I take those buses, so I'm busing those buses into an all vocals bus. I know it's a little confusing, but especially if you end up picking up this template, you'll see what I mean. Basically, I'm just creating another bus out of the two groups, and it really those touches are really a lifesaver when it comes to adjusting macros, so that you're not just going in here and adjusting all of these faders and trying to figure out how to do that delicately. It just makes it so much easier to just bus everything, and it will save you a ton of processing power when you're throwing plugins in on things. Okay, so walking through these more individually, what you're going to notice is that I'm not just adding a ton of stuff to each of these, right? So take like the kick, for example. I've got this pretty simple EQ move. This tends to be where I start. Take this for what it is. It's going to depend on your sample that you're importing, but I tend to boost a lot around here just to get more of that punch behind the kick, and then I want some of the snappiness at the high end. So I have that over here. I tend to cut out a little bit of mud, so I've got this here. But again, use your ears. Don't just go with everything I've put here. It's gonna vary. You're gonna need to adjust, but these are just great starting places. And just another note, all of these compressors I've got on here, I tend not to over compress too early. So you'll notice I've got compressors on these channels, and then like on this drums bus, I've got another compressor. But it's not doing a ton either. I'm trying not to let this over compress, because what's going to happen is I've got a compressor on the kick, and then a compressor on the kick on the drums bus, and then of course you're going to have your limiter on your master, which is just a cranked out compressor. So you don't want to over compress too early is my philosophy. So that's how I've got everything dialed here. So as you go through these, you'll notice it's just very simple EQ, sometimes just EQ and compressor. All the drums lead into the drum bus, has the EQ and the compressor. You kind of get the idea. Okay. And then the way I've got this organized just as well as a kick high and a kick low. So kick sub is how I've noted it here, so that I can highlight, more of the low end if I want to, or more of the snappiness if I want to. Same with the bass. I've got the bass low and a bass high, and the EQ curves are kind of flip-flopped essentially. Again, these are great starting places, but make sure you're just listening in. Just as well, I've got some grit on these guys. I like a little bit of grit on the bass because it just helps it cut through a bit more, a little bit of that saturation. A little bit goes a long way, it really does. And then with the guitar section, what I tend to do, I tend to keep these relatively dry in the mix stage. Obviously, you can totally just go in and add your reverbs, compressors, whatever you need to do. I tend to find that actually a nice room reverb, if anything, is pretty solid, just depending on the genre that you're mixing. But I've kept these pretty dry and mainly focused on the EQ and compressor moves. And I do tend to stick around these moves a lot. I'm actually a guitarist. That's my first instrument. And so I've dealt with them a whole lot. And this is just tends to be how I deal with them EQ wise. And so you can adjust this, of course, however you need to. Going through, I tend to pan one of the guitars to the left or to the right just to get some stereo width in there. And actually, if you have, say, a doubled guitar track, I'll pan one left and one right. And so that tends to work really well. Or if you have two pretty distinct guitar tracks that are going the entire song, I'll pan one left and one right. But at a bass line, I tend to at least have one pan, so that's why I've got this here. And then I've got my keys. Now you'll notice here something interesting. I've got keys and keys verb. So keys verb is usually just a double of this track, but I throw a pretty heavy reverb on it. And I'll kind of mix that in and out as I want to. It's one of those things that just works. Like, I've used it throughout so many of my mixes, and it really just works so well. It adds this nice, almost like pad in the background that just sounds so good. And then speaking of pad, got some pad here. Sometimes I'll pan one of my pad tracks as well, or if usually if I have two, I'll pan one of them just to get, again, some of that stereo separation. And be mindful too, as you're panning, I will tend to watch and make sure that if I've, say, panned something left, that I'm not just panning everything left. I'm going left and right and just trying to really build the space out. Okay, so vocals is where it gets interesting. Everyone does this differently. So I tend to do my tuning and a lot of vocal processing in the mix phase. So I tend to save a lot of this for here. And so you'll notice this channel is pretty heavy with this stuff. And just as well, I've got a vocal verb here, just a lot like the keys verb. I especially love this on vocals. If I sometimes skip out on this one, I never skip out on this one. I'll usually print this when I'm happy with it, and then I'll just verb it out and then maybe adjust some EQ. But you'll notice I've got channel EQ, fresh air, which, by the way, I've tried to keep this as stock as possible. This is pretty much entirely stock except for this plugin, but it is a free plugin called Fresh Air by Slate. It's super, super handy. I've had it for years. It's always been free. It should always be free. If it's not, I'm so sorry by the time you download this, but it should still be free. And it just gives this nice top end or mid-range sparkle to your vocals, and I really love it. A little goes a long way. I wouldn't overdo it. Sometimes people absolutely crank this and then I think it sounds awful, but that's what I do there. Got my compressor, de-esser, a little bit of tape delay I really like on vocals just all around. There are way better de-essers out there, by the way. Logic's it's fine, but I tend to use a lot of the Slate products. So if I have any recommendation, I would say just spend the $15 a month and get the Slate everything bundle and just use their de-esser because it's way better. So something I should mention, and you'll notice in my vocal strip, I do not have a tuning software here. Trying to keep things as stock as possible, of course. I still could not get comfortable with Logic's stock pitch correction. It just would not work for me. It never has worked for me. So eventually I ended up buying Melodyne just a few years ago, and it was super great. It's been super great. It was like $50 at the time. It's just the basic version. So that's really what I'd recommend here, is just go get that basic version of Melodyne and be happy and have a great day. It'll serve you super well and has some pretty nice Logic specific features that I think you're gonna really love. Okay, so you got your vocals. Again, these are going in what I call the lead vocal bus, okay? Both of these lead vocal tracks. Then you've got your background vocals. I've got a low, mid, high, and this is just from how I've gotten vocal stems from people. It's just how I tend to organize this. Everyone does their vocals differently, but when I've received stems or whenever I've written music and produced music, my vocals almost always end up going this way, almost like this choir arrangement. If you can adjust low, mids, highs. I tend to keep my lows pretty centered. Mids and highs I'll pan just because That's kind of where I want those frequencies, especially since I've already got my guitars and keys in the mix, taking some of the middle of the mix. So I like to kind of spread these guys out a little bit. And so all of my background vocals are being bussed. And again, I've got basically my lead vocal bus, and I've got my background vocal bus, and then I merge those into one final bus called the lead or the all vocals bus, and you'll see that in the template if you download it as well. So as you're looking at your final mix, really what I'd recommend here is if you're looking for a good master, go hire a mastering engineer. They're usually the more inexpensive part of this whole process. Producers and mix engineers can be, upwards of the thousands of dollars at times, usually at best several $100s. Most of the time, a good mastering engineer can be super affordable. I've paid people $50 for an incredible master. They use real outboard gear. They gave me revisions. It was amazing. So I would just recommend finding a mastering engineer. However, if that's not your gig, if you're really just not feeling it, I did leave this little mastering strip over here. So you'll notice with the EQs, the first thing I've got here, I'm not making huge moves. I just kind of left these little nodes here for you to adjust, just very small moves. If you find yourself making broad brush strokes here, you probably need to go back and adjust your mix. Just as well, I've got Slate Fresh Air on here. I tend to just bring a little bit of this in at the end to kind of get some last minute bite and airiness to the whole mix. So it really does nice on the master bus. And then I've got a limiter on here, and I kind of just use this to even things out. I try not to squash my mix unless that's just really what you're going for. I really try not to squash this too much. I'll feed a little bit of gain into it and kind of limit the output and then call it a good day. So that tends to be my mastering strip, pretty straightforward. Again, I put the production first, I put the mixing second, and I put the mastering last. And so I really am not doing a whole lot here. And that's how I have this set up. It's pretty minimalistic. So that's the template. I really hope this was helpful, and I really do think if you use a template like this, it's going to help you make music faster. It's going to be more consistent, and ultimately I think your songs are going to spend less time on the hard drive and more time on Spotify playlists. If you want this template, I've got the link in the description. You can follow that to my website and you can pick it up today. Just as well, if you have any questions, you can send me an email, and it's info@alexvelty.com. I'll also put that in the description as well.